Your injuries are chronic because you're avoiding them. You're afraid to actually deal with them directly because you don't want to re-injure them. You can't return to high levels of performance because you're not putting in a high level of effort to getting back in shape. If you're dealing with a sports injury, you're probably pretty frustrated with your progress. I see this all the time. People start a rehab program and they make really good progress in the acute phase, but then that progress stalls. They lose faith in it and in rehab in general, and then they eventually either accept that they're going to be held back at their sport forever, or even worse, they just quit. And I hear you, I've been there. Since I've started climbing and weightlifting, I've had shoulder impingement, golfer's elbow, tenosynovitis, biceps tendonitis, and both wrist and ankle sprains. And I've recovered from them all. But I experienced the very same problems in progress each time I saw a specialist. In my experience, the key to making real progress and returning to surpass your previous levels of performance is to stop babying your injured body part and to actually challenge and train it and to force it to adapt just like you would any other body part. My golfer's elbow only got better when I started methodically overloading pull-ups again. I took my previous 1 rep max on pull-ups to my current 10 rep max. My shoulder impingement only got better when I started actually hanging on the bar with my real body weight. And eventually I started incorporating things like swings and 1-arm hangs. My biceps tendonitis only got better as I surpassed my previous overhead pushing strength and incorporated heavy isolation exercises for the shoulders. My wrist sprain only got better when I actually increased the loading and started supporting my whole body weight. Now I'm back to doing handstands. You get the idea here? The point is that you kinda gotta actually do hard work at some point. Eventually you have to take off the training wheels and actually do stuff that's really, really challenging. So in this video, I'm going to share my personal rehab story, then I'm going to talk about the general problem I see with many rehab programs out there, the solution to that problem, and finally present you with the framework you can use to assess your rehab exercises in the future. The footage you're watching here is of actual prehab and rehab exercises that I'm currently doing in my program. So we have the Cuban rotation, which is rehab work I'm using for my rotator cuff for that biceps tendonitis injury. I'm completely pain-free at this point from the biceps injury, and I'm trying to strengthen my rotator cuff so that doesn't happen again. Then we have Zurcher Jefferson curls, which I'm doing to strengthen my back. I don't have an existing injury there, but I was doing Romanian deadlifts in my previous program, and I started to realize that my back was kind of like the weak link in my deadlift. I would lose stability on the way up, and I just sort of seemed to be like leaking strength when I was doing my reps. So now I'm just trying to get my back muscles and my spine strong as hell to be able to deadlift more in the future. So the key points here are, these are just 2 normal exercises in my program. If I didn't tell you they were prehab or rehab, you probably wouldn't notice because it looks exactly like the rest of my training. I'm treating them the exact same way as I treat my squats and my pull-ups. Notice the intensity. I'm not afraid to take sets to failure sometimes. I'm consistently trying to progress in the reps and the weight. In other words, I'm strength and hypertrophy training. I'm not babying these areas that I actually want to develop. I'm treating them with energy, intensity, and a genuine desire to get brutally strong over time. So there's a big caveat here, which is don't be stupid. Don't just take one of these exercises, load up as much weight as you can, and go after it in the name of rehab. Obviously, there's a high risk of getting injured if you do that. One of the main points I'm going to make here is that we want to use smart strength programming techniques for our rehab. And that always means starting off with less weight than we think we can manage and slowly increasing steadily over time. It's not about how much you do in the first session, it's how much you do in the 50th session, the 100th session, because we're going to do this for long periods of time. So this philosophy applies to both rehab and prehab. This is the period of our training where the acute injury has healed, and for all intents and purposes, we're like fine on a daily basis, but you're still left with some sort of dysfunction, some weakness, or lack of control that's actually holding you back in sport. The first phase of acute healing after an injury, in my experience, has been handled really well by physicians and physiotherapists. They've helped me get really specific in isolating the injured body parts, reducing the pain, and recovering range of motion for sort of like daily life activities. But then it usually stops there. Their advice ceases to be useful to progress past that. But here's the thing, I don't just want an ankle that I can walk on, I want an ankle that I can jump on, fall on, turn around in circles, and move rapidly on. I don't want elbows that are just strong enough to carry the groceries. I want to be able to do 1-arm pull-ups, and I want to be able to do dynamic bouldering moves. And most physio programs aren't really going to help you get there. I want high performance, not just average performance. Most people I know who do sports have a collection of weaknesses from past injuries that they never really worked on. And they say their injuries are like fine for normal use cases, but it just obviously holds them back in their actual sport. They generally became pain-free at a low level of performance in their specific exercises, but they never took the time to rebuild a high-level performance that they can apply to their actual sport. So when I had golfer's elbow, my physio had me doing a couple of exercises for wrist rotation and flexion. And basically what I would do is I would bend my elbow to various positions, and then I would use the opposite hand to apply force to it and to do eccentrics and things like this. And at first this was really, really useful. I could really well modulate the intensity and sort of trigger exactly the right amount of pain. And it was really helpful at restoring motion in the elbow at the beginning. But after a month or so, I got these movements completely pain-free. But then when I started climbing, the pain would come back. When I would try to do pull-ups, the pain would come back. And the physio had no useful advice for me on how to actually restart my actual sport. So over the next 3 years, I would re-injure both of my elbows 3 times when trying to ramp up my climbing volume again. And it was so frustrating, but I finally cracked it, and now I'm doing something completely different with all of my rehab. The problem was that there was this phase of acute rehab, but then no chronic or long-term rehab. Those specific exercises were really useful while the tissue was healing, but once it had sort of healed, the process of actually making my joint stronger, taking it from a really weak position back to a much stronger position, I didn't have any exercises for that, and I didn't have any programming for it. And so I didn't do any of that, and I got re-injured. So what I eventually realized was that the only way to make long-term rehab work, to actually go from a very weak state to a very strong state, is to make meaningful progress in strength, muscle size, mobility, or endurance in the long term. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means applying normal methods of strength training, hypertrophy training, mobility training, or endurance training. It doesn't mean doing very specific physio exercises at a low intensity. We just need to use the same strategies that we'd use in healthy but weak tissue, because that's really what it is. It's not injured anymore, it's just really, really weak. So there are 2 big problems I see in most people's rehab programs. Problem number 1 is that the exercises themselves are often very ill-suited for long-term progress. So my example of using the opposite hand as load is just not measurable at all, and so there's no way to know where I am and where I'm going. There's no way to consistently progress the load over time. For shoulder and rotator cuff issues, a common one is the wall slide, where you sort of make this W to V position against the wall, which is great at working at mobility for a little bit, but you just can't progress it over time unless you do something like Cuban rotations. When people have hips issues for running, it's always doing clamshells and dead bugs in order to work on their stability and glute activation. And these can be really good for retraining movements, but they're terrible at developing actual physical attributes over the long term. Have you ever seen someone with big glutes and they told you, yeah, I just did clamshells for years? Well, no, of course not. They did squats, lunges, and hip thrusts, heavy, for years. That's how you build big glutes. And we really have to think long term here. Strength takes a long time to develop. Muscles take a long time to build. Think about how much time you've put into your bench press over the years. Think how much time you've put into your pull-ups over the years. Think how much time you spent stretching to get the splits. And these are areas that weren't your specific weak link, right? So when we have tissue or a movement pattern that's extremely weak compared to other areas, it's gonna take a long time to get better, which means you're not gonna do a 4-week rehab program and then just go back to hitting it hard. No, you're gonna work on this for months and years if you want it to actually become robust and take your performance to the next level. It has to become part of your real training. We could realistically be talking about doubling or tripling your strength or performance in a specific lift in order to get it on par with the rest of your body, which isn't malfunctioning. So it's gonna take time, right? So you have to be able to progress over the long term. So long-term progressive overload is the single most important factor for making sure that rehab and prehab actually work for you. So here's a framework I like to use to assess whether a given exercise is gonna be worthwhile in my rehab. First, it has to be specific. So it has to actually develop some sort of attribute that I wanna work on. This could be the strength of a specific muscle, this could be the range of motion in a joint, whatever. It has to do something actually specific to one of your goals. This does not, however, mean that it needs to look exactly like the target movement that you're trying to get better at overall. It might, but it doesn't have to. An exercise needs to be measurable. Can you measure the intensity of it? Can you measure the range of motion? If not, you're not going to be able to track your progress over time. It's as simple as that. An exercise needs to be overloadable. This means that we can add load over time. This can be done with weight or with bands, but it just has to be some way that you can continually make progress for months in it. Weight is the easiest way, almost all the time. Finally, it has to allow a large range of motion. Even though, especially in an injured body part, you might have a limited range of motion, we want the motion to be limited by what your joint can do and not by the setup of the exercise or of the apparatus you're actually using. So even if you start working in a limited range of motion at the beginning, the idea is you'll have the opportunity to progress it over time. If the exercise won't allow you to progress your range of motion, then you won't progress your range of motion, and if that was one of your goals in the first place, you're not going to reach it. The second problem that people have in their rehab is they don't know that they need to overload their tissues in order to progress. They start with 3 sets of 10 of some exercise, and then 10 weeks later, it's still 3 sets of 10. Well, like, how did you think you'd be able to do more after 10 weeks if you never actually did more? Of course not. Previously injured tissue is no different than normal tissue. Weak tissue is no different than strong tissue. Both need to be pushed close to their limits in order to adapt. The difference is that the things that you're rehabbing are actually probably weaker than the things that you're not rehabbing. So that means that your rehab needs to become prehab, and it needs to continue even after the injured body parts feel fine, because you want to actually address the underlying problem so that you won't injure them again. So this means training hard, increasing the volume, intensity, and range of motion and other such parameters slowly and consistently over time, but it'll feel just as hard as the rest of your training. It won't feel easy. Is there a risk of re-injury? Yeah, of course. And it's okay to be a little bit cautious, but if you avoid actually stressing your tissues and actually focusing on them with intensity, you will not get better. So I'm willing to take that risk. I think it's a lot better to challenge our tissue in the controlled setting of a rehab exercise in the gym versus letting your body encounter those same challenges in the chaos of your actual sport. It's a lot easier to bail out on a set of pull-ups if things go wrong than it is to encounter the same stress on your elbow while you're rock climbing hundreds of feet in the air. So if there's one key takeaway here, it's that rehab shouldn't really be any different than your regular training. You gotta push yourself in order to make gains. You gotta do it consistently for a really long time. And if you actually want this injury to be a thing of the past, you're probably gonna have to work on it for months and years. But like in most cases, it actually is possible. So no matter how discouraged you are right now, just put in the work. That's all you can do. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I appreciate you coming here to hang out with me today. Please like and subscribe if you got value from this, and share with someone else if you like it. Follow me at @TheJohnGraham on Twitter, where I tweet about all these types of things. You can DM me if you have any questions for your training. And that's it. Stay strong, have a great day, and train hard.